I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This session's been great. And today I'll be talking about brain network organization as the computational architecture of cognition. And I'm going to focus in, given the time constraints, on really looking at emotion regulation and mental health implications of this perspective I'm going to share. So I want to begin by asking a question. What is the brain's large-scale network architecture? One way to start to answer this question is to think of brain systems as graph communities. These are clusters of highly interconnected nodes. So in this case, there are 4 graph communities associated by a single hub node. Why do we need these algorithms? Well, even in this really simple case, the data is going to come in looking more like this, and we need some way to even begin to see the structure. And so we applied these one of these algorithms to a whole brain resting state fMRI graph using this set of brain regions defined by Glasser et al. In 2016. And this is how the data come in after some pre-processing and calculating all the pairwise correlations. You get a region by region matrix, and if it's randomly ordered, you really can't see any structure. But if we apply one of these algorithms and sort the regions based on the clusters, you can see them along the diagonal as these kind of red clusters. And then we can color code them, as you can see on the edges of the matrix, and then project that back to the brain surface. And what we find is that there's a variety of really well-known brain systems established over 100 years ago, such as the visual system, auditory system, somatomotor system. But we also get more recently discovered brain systems such as the frontoparietal network in yellow or the default mode network in red. We recently also expanded this into subcortex, and this atlas is freely available on the lab website if anyone's interested. So focusing in on one of these networks, the frontoparietal network, I want to share a theory that we've been developing. So we call it the flexible hub theory. And it's really building on decades of work showing that this frontoparietal system, typically people will focus on the lateral prefrontal cortex, but really it's this extended network. It's really deeply involved in, or consistently involved in, implementing goal-directed cognition. And one really interesting thing, if you look across the literature, is that it's really domain general cognition, and it seems to be sensitive to the difficulty of the task, the novelty of the task, but not so much the particular type of stimulus or whether it's a motor task or not. It's even involved in emotion regulation, apparently, and a wide variety of different things. And so taking this property into account, we started trying to think about how could it have this domain general function. Well, one thing is that we found a lot of evidence that it has global connectivity. It acts as a kind of hub across different networks. So that makes sense from the perspective of it being able to interact with a wide variety of different representations across these domains. But also, we started thinking in terms of how engineered systems control things, such as just control theory in general. And the system we're probably most familiar with is something like a thermostat, as shown here. You have what are called actuator connections that interact to, like in a causal sense, to change the temperature, and then sensor connections to tell if that change is pushing towards the particular goal that a person set on the thermostat. And so by analogy, we could think of the frontoparietal network as potentially having this kind of setup where there's some evidence that maybe basal ganglia uses reward prediction to set the control system set point, and then there's a nonlinear dynamic interaction with interacting with other brain systems to bring the brain into a particular goal state. And so applying to this model to mental health, the idea is that it's not in particular set up to maintain mental health, but that's a side product of just everyday goal pursuit when something's called a symptom. It's a harmful dysfunction, which by definition is something that the individual does not find agreeable, and so that would set the control system to try to control that symptom. And so in this case, if you had the core harmful dysfunction, say an overactive amygdala, there might be this feedback loop where the control system can begin to implement strategies to reduce that overactivation by feedback control. And so if we kind of step back and think really broadly about this, the idea is that for any given mental disorder or condition, there's a core harmful dysfunction that's really at the core of the issue, and that's specific to that disorder on one axis. Whereas on the other axis, you have this interaction with this domain general control system capacity, which will determine where the symptoms fall. And then you have this diagnosis threshold in yellow. Whereas that's just, we have to set a line where we say someone has a disorder or not, but in reality, right, it's a continuous thing. And importantly, you could, the control system capacity, even though it's not determining the symptoms by itself, there would be a lot of cases where you'd be on one side, and then if you had a stronger control system, you could end up on the other side. And so the really important thing here is that whereas the harmful dysfunction, the treatment would very likely always involve some kind of specific treatment to the particular disorder. From the control system, domain general control system idea, if you had some treatment for that to increase its capacity, it would supposedly work across many different disorders because it has this kind of domain general quality. We published on this theory back in 2014, and over the next couple of years, we collected a large data set in healthy individuals, but because all of this is a continuous issue here, we wanted to see if we collected depression symptoms, would we see some evidence of control system capacity correlating with individual differences in depression symptoms, and indeed that's what we found. So really tied to this theory is that global connectivity, that aspect that is probably core to why this network is domain general. And so this is out-of-network resting state functional connectivity, and it's just average out-of-network connectivity for each individual. So this is consistent with this idea. But one thing to note is that the connectivity changes across these individuals are quite small. So these are average Pearson correlation values. And so we're down, like, whether you're 0.02 this way or that way, apparently relates to really meaningful out-of-scanner experiences related to depression symptoms. And so this really highlights, well, this is better highlighted in this other study where we looked across ADHD, autism, spectrum disorder, and 2 schizophrenia data sets, and found that at the whole brain functional network level, this organization doesn't really change much across these different disorders and with healthy individuals matched on a variety of different demographics. And so I think this study is very important for just getting kind of perspective. So in the previous slide, I showed that there can be a relationship between these small differences and meaningful outcomes. And I think of this as both like a bad thing, like it's gonna be hard to find really robust biomarkers, I think, at least using connectivity measures, but it could also mean that we wouldn't have to change those measures very much to get meaningful outcomes in treatment. We just have to find the needle in the haystack, so to speak. So thinking a little more deeply about this, we started wondering how could these small connectivity differences potentially have some impact on behavior. And one idea is that there may be a large number of small resting state functional connectivity changes that have a large impact on task activations, and then that would kind of mediate the relationship with behavior. And this is based on some other work of ours I don't have time to get into that show that what you see in resting state functional connectivity also applies across a wide variety of different tasks. So it's not like resting state is some sort of strange state in a really deep sense. There are subtle things in those matrices that are probably strange because someone's not focused on a task, but overall it generalizes quite well. And so we started thinking of this as potentially telling us something about activity flow, even during task states. What do I mean by activity flow? So I mean the movement of activations between brain regions. So for instance, if you're driving along and you come up on an intersection, you see a red light, supposedly some red representing portions of your visual cortex will become more active, and then that activity will flow up to your motor cortex so you can press on the brake. And so I literally mean that kind of process that we experience every day. So how do we test this? So we developed a predictive model. So the idea is that we're going to use this kind of idea to predict task-evoked activity flow. And you can think of this as kind of simple, as in minimal assumption neural network simulations. So to illustrate, you could have this particular brain region. In our case, we're looking with fMRI. So you see this this amplitude change that we're interested in. And in separate data, we find during resting state that there's a high correlation with this orange region. And that tells us something about how connected they might be and how activity might flow between them. We can then simulate that flow based on the strength of the connection and the strength of the activity in the other region, and then make a prediction about how active that other region should be. And then we can go, because we have full brain coverage on our measures, we can go and check how correct we were. And of course, if we had, say, a weaker connection here, we would have made a prediction of a smaller response, and we can see how correct we were. So here's an illustration of the algorithm. We do this one region at a time using all the other regions' activity during a task, and we use resting state connectivity to tell us how much that activity is likely in our predictive model to influence held out region J, and then we sum all those together to make that one prediction for region J. We then move on and do that for every other region. Here's the connectivity matrix we're using for this. And then we have the Human Connectome project data set, which has a wide variety of different tasks with different domains. Just to kind of orient you, the motor task here has the motor network as especially active relative to all the other tasks. So we run this algorithm for every little cell in this matrix, and these are the predictions that we get at the group level. So really high prediction accuracy, suggesting that this connectivity information is consistent with this activity flow model. We can also do this in a voxel-wise manner. In this case, we want to make sure that we don't have any circularity in the analysis, so we actually exclude 10 millimeters out from each voxel we're predicting because of the inherent spatial smoothness of fMRI, and we're predicting based on everything outside of that 10 millimeter sphere for each voxel. This is the motor task, so you can see the motor strip quite nicely, and then here's the prediction that we get at the group level. It captures most of the variance. So this also works at the individual subject level quite well at 0.73, which is well above chance. So here's a reasoning task, very different cognitive task, and also a very different activation pattern. And again, we get a very high prediction accuracy there. And again, also at the individual subject level. And the code for this is available on the lab website if anyone wants to try it out. So trying to get back to mental disorders, in this case actually neurological conditions, we're trying to apply this kind of activity flow framework to gain deeper insights into these kind of conditions. So this is pre-Alzheimer's disease. The idea is that you have healthy activations, healthy older adults in a particular task context, and then we want to be able to see, if we look in the individuals with preclinical Alzheimer's disease, can we kind of infer what role a change in their connectivity might have in changing their activations. And this is on the way to getting to behavior, since the activations are tied more closely to behavior than the connectivity measures. And so we have this disruption in the activity flow that we can see in the connectivity, and then we want to see if that kind of transforms when we run these little simulations, these activity flow mappings. Does that give accurate predictions of what the preclinical activations look like? So it's the same basic algorithm as I described before with a twist. So now the blue regions, the blue spheres are representing healthy older adult activity, and then the connections are from preclinical older adults. And then we're trying to predict the preclinical older adult activity over in region J, and we do that just as before, one region at a time. And in this case, we're looking at a genetic biomarker for preclinical Alzheimer's disease versus healthy older adults. So this is just the predicted preclinical data. And in the Stroop task, and you can see that it's fairly good prediction. It's a much harder prediction than what we were doing before, because now we're trying to transform healthy activity into basically unhealthy activity. And so it's suggesting that a hypothesis where you said maybe there's a change in the connectivity that's underlying the changes in activations during tasks, that's consistent with the data to a large extent. And this is the contrast between them also works quite well. Okay, so some take-home messages. I provided some evidence that large-scale functional connectivity gives some insights into the neural mechanisms of cognition. Also, the frontoparietal network is a flexible hub network with a role in flexible cognition, and also, because of its domain general nature, also the maintenance of mental health. And finally, I provided some evidence that activity flow mapping helps determine the role of connectivity in cognitive task activations and also alterations in different clinical conditions. Finally, I want to thank my lab, my collaborators, and my funding.